Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, the East Bay's best podcast. Hosted by Jared Asch, bringing you in-depth conversations with the leaders shaping your community.
Today, we are going to go to the town of Moraga with now Mayor Kerry Hillis, who was also the very first guest here on the Capstone Conversation for episode 1. That was when he was just a regular councilman, and he has rotated to his term of mayor.
Congratulations.
Welcome back, Kerry.
Thank you for the opportunity as a new elected official to have a platform where I could really just speak my mind about what was going on. It was impactful, and I've listened and been a fan of the show ever since. And I really think that you are providing a fantastic service to the East Bay at large and to the Bay Area in general of what you're doing here. Because again, with everything that's faced the media environment in the Bay Area, it's really hard now for residents and even for elected officials to be sure that folks can stay informed. Thank you for what you're doing, and I'm proud to be back again.
I appreciate that and glad to know you're a listener.
You and my mom makes two.
Actually, I'm kidding. She doesn't listen. She lives in Florida. I love the format of this. It allows us to go in-depth conversation about what's going on. Even though sometimes we cover one town or one water district or one transit issue, I'm trying to make it look regionally with those in-depth conversations and lessons learned for everybody. The first question I want is, I think we started this, you were your first year into elected office. You now in for 4 years, 3.5 years, you're the mayor. What have you learned for people who are just in their first year, have just finished that, or are looking at running?
I would just tell folks that this job is as much or as little as you want it to be. When it comes down to ultimately what our responsibility is on a council or on really in any of these bodies, it's to be a decision maker and to vote, to facilitate a dialogue in the community. As long as you show up for the meetings, you're filling that role, but there can be so much more that you can do than that. And it takes time to really learn. They just assume that they've been doing this for long. They'll understand politics is different. I'm not saying it's better, but it is really hard. And the biggest skill to learn is the ability to be able to read a room. And the room isn't just the room that you're in. The room is being open enough so that you appreciate the fact that there's a perspective out there and knowing what that perspective is. Because when you're on a council meeting now, it streams online. Very soon this summer, we're going to be forced to do virtual public comment. There are harsh comments that come. It's the reason why most of the Bay Area has abolished virtual public comment, because we've gotten horrible anti-Semitic, racist, sexist attacks, primarily from people that live in Florida, where, no offense to Florida, but happens to be where the group is organized, that to come out here and say negative things about us in our meetings. And you just have to learn how to brush it off, continue with the meeting, follow the rules, because the reality is everyone has freedom of speech. But knowing how to read the room and knowing what is going to basically resonate with your community is the key skill to being successful on council.
I want to pick up on one thing there that you touched on is the relationship with elected officials versus staff, right? And most people don't realize elected officials tend to have other jobs. They are not full-time like staff is in a lot of these cities in the East Bay. Talk about that relationships and what is the role of staff versus the elected official in your case.
Sure. Most cities in the country are more of a weak mayor system. The town manager doesn't like me to call it that, but that's what it is. My power as mayor is essentially to be the presiding officer at a meeting. The power to actually provide the administration of a town, that is with the CEO of the organization, and that is not the mayor in most cases. It is with the city manager or the town manager in my case, and they are the one that is responsible for managing their staff. The only staff that a council is really responsible for is hiring and managing the town manager, in my case, and the town attorney. Everyone else is is an employee of the town, which is the boss is the town manager. What the role is that's different, again, is staff, as you said, have this as a full-time job. I am a government affairs professional by employment and training. I have a territory that is over half the geographic space of the United States, not just the continental. And I have a big job helps pay my salary that I have to travel for frequently. I also have 3 small children that it's my privilege to be called their daddy. And my full-time job is not being the mayor, even though being the mayor is a full-time job, takes more time potentially than my paying job. And in Lamorinda, we're unique where the elected officials on the councils of all 3 communities get $0. We all knew that coming in. You can make a policy case that it is a bit of an elitist stance because it actually limits who self-selects to go for these things. It's basically the people that can afford it. I clearly am one of those. And I really love the challenge, the experience, but I can also see how and why many other communities decided, in fact, the majority of communities decided to go a different path.
But some of the cities pay either $500 or $700 incidentals a month. I think some of the Tri-Valley, because they have independently elected mayors, pay, but not enough to live on.
No, that's not the point that I'm making. I would say, like, what I've heard from some electeds in other communities, and I think that they really phrase this correctly, which is you shouldn't make money in this job, but it also shouldn't really cost you anything. But that may be an overly strong way of looking at it because the way I view this is service, and service is supposed to be a sacrifice. But at the same time, there are a lot of people, even in my community, which is, I know, generally perceived as being affluent, who can't afford childcare. And even if it was $250, that might help a mother who was contemplating running for the council to actually go out and do it because it pays for their childcare. So it's not an issue that I'm going to pursue. It's one that I'm aware of. And I do believe that democracy functions best when people from all backgrounds in a community are able to participate.
I was talking to one woman who's an elected official here in the East Bay recently, and she was saying, no, I can't go to an event before 9:30 because I dropped my school. And I'm a parent that does that myself. My wife and I split it, each take a couple days a week, but I've got to cut this interview short because I actually have to go pick up my kids and chauffeur them around to their afternoon activities today. Today is my day for that. So I hear what you're saying, and that's come up on our women's episode in particular, where they talk about having childcare or flexible schedules to when these events can happen.
And you thank my colleagues from the last council actually for changing the start time of our council meetings. Because I know for some, there was some pushback here on moving our meetings to 5:30. But for me, it meant that I might have a chance to actually be home for bedtime, which I don't just have 3 kids. I have 3 little kids, 2 in elementary school and 1 about to start TK soon. The opportunity to be able to be there at really what is a precious time as a parent. I really thank people for their openness to being flexible all the time. And it also ensures that our committee meeting or our council meetings end earlier so that we have that opportunity to be home, potentially even to eat dinner. And it also is great not to necessarily consistently be there at 10:30 every council meeting.
Although there's always some that run late. And I think the legislatures in California is grappling with that because there are a number of women from here in the East Bay that insist on being home, maybe not for dinner, but at least for bedtime. They see their kids every night and every morning, and they have to work around that schedule. All right, let's dive into Moraga and what's happening in Moraga. What are your and the city council's priorities right now? What are you focused on? And actually, before that, refresh the audience. Tell us a little bit about what is Moraga as a community for those who might not be familiar?
Sure, thank you. Moraga is a small community. One of the first questions I think anyone from Moraga gets is, where is that exactly? Is that in Southern California? And that's from people in the Bay Area. The second question people receive, or they, not a question, but how you help people identify is say, have you heard of St. Mary's College? Which anyone that participates in March Madness on an annual basis has heard of St. Mary's College. And then all of a sudden there's a light come on. They still don't know really where we are, but since we're connected with St. Mary's, we must be somewhere on the map. And I recently was talking to some of the folks over at Pleasant Hill for their visitors bureau, putting out a pamphlet that tells where all the great things are around Pleasant Hill. But the only traditional four-year university in the community that's only a hop, skip, and a jump away from them was not on their list. I think it is now, and it's on their map, and which I thank them for that. But I think it just goes to show we are a small community, and that's by design. We were founded 50 years ago, and part of the reason for that was in California, where we were getting a lot of residential development. There was a plan to have multiple highways passing through this area. And the folks at the time, similar to in Seattle and a lot of other communities, said, no, we really don't want that for our community. We want more open spaces. We want more of a lot of the things that we have now to be preserved. And thankfully for them, they were able to get that accomplished. Abundance really diagnoses the problem. And in fact, California is highlighted as one of the problems that really have gotten a lot of municipal governance in the United States stuck in the mud. CEQA, which is a fantastic thing that helped us, and NEPA, which helped us to have clean air, cleaner drinking water. Where we are now, though, 50 years later, is a lot of the tools that were rightly used in the past to help to moderate and make sense of development have been weaponized. You can see it in my own community where you may have a developer who, and I'm not going to single out anyone in particular, you may have a developer that proposes a multi-story building, and that developer works with the community left and sideways to do less than what they're allowed to do, both by state law and by our zoning, because they want to try to make the community pleased with the end result. And they still get sued using CEQA as a weapon. And here, I'm not saying there's not some reality to some of the arguments. We are in an incredibly fire-prone area. But I find it challenging to believe that adding, I don't know, less than 100 units in a building is really going to have a catastrophic effect in and of itself on emergency evacuation. There's some situations that may be somewhat analogous to what I just described here in town, which may resolve themselves soon. And they will resolve themselves not with seeing nothing happening, but they're just going to see something happening that's slightly less dense. Great job for having the town expend a lot of money on legal fees. Great job in slowing down that development and making us less attractive to get a lot of the amenities that our residents really desire. But that's really the story of what's happened with a lot of these laws in the last 50 years. We have beautiful open spaces here in Moraga. We have a new one, which unfortunately the town council did not support, but is loved by everyone in the community, Painted, which the John Muir Land Trust recently was able to acquire. We have a hillside and ridgeline ordinance, which limits how buildings can really take over the view sheds on our hillsides and ridgelines, which we are in valleys here in Moraga. We are working to keep that beauty, but at the same time, we also have challenges. The town of Moraga just did. We hired an economic development consultant. We are doubling down on economic development. Not my council, but me as an individual, am saying that Ream Center is our downtown. It has our post office or CVS. It has at least one, hint, hint, grocery store going in. It has our only movie theater. But we're also having some exciting restaurants coming in. If we're going to have an opportunity for a downtown in Moraga, Ream Center is it. Are doing everything we can to increase the attractiveness both for students at St. Mary's and the student bodies that are available for our schools, which is a much more sustainable solution to closing budget holes over the long term than providing affordable housing for the folks that work at Safeway, for the folks that work at our new grocery outlet, for the folks that work at St. Mary's, at the schools, to be able to afford to actually live in our community. Yes, a lot of public employees are paid a lot, but honestly, it's still not enough to afford to live in Moraga. Our average property value in Lamorinda is over $2 million. In Moraga, it's just slightly under $2 million. That's a lot. I don't know how you afford that on a teacher's salary alone.
You can't, the math doesn't work. But, and this is an issue that's come up in a lot of cities. And back in early February, we had a Municipal Financing 101, and it talks about this. And it's come up in Sassoon and Rio Vista and other small cities. Is you've fought growth for a long time. Sales tax is changing, even in a Walnut Creek or a Vacaville, which have higher sales tax and lots of shopping. They are facing headwinds of how people purchase things, how that revenue comes into the cities, and they're having less of it. And so cities who haven't grown, one of the issues too with small towns and school districts is turnover at houses. So it takes on average, I'm not a realtor, but I think it was 37 years for a house that has raised kids in it to retire to turn over. That is a long time because you don't have kids, little kids in elementary school for 37 years. But what I'm hearing in this is the same consistent message with every other small town is you need to grow your economy. And it's not about another local coffee shop. You have to look at bigger items and attract more housing.
The problem in Moraga is probably more exaggerated than in many communities in California. Our nationally ranked high school, it is at the bottom of the list of high schools in terms of the revenue it receives, the property tax increment to help fund the school. The same goes with our public schools. And what is the reason for that? There's really a generational divide here in Moraga where a lot of folks were able to purchase their homes when things were a lot more affordable, and they've stayed. And God bless them. We need them here. We need our elders to help us in really navigating challenges to make our community as accessible and friendly as possible. Because the town put a lockdown on almost any development, what that created then was that all public financing for schools for the town was all based on. And this is actually an issue that is common in all of Lamorinda, where our schools are some of the lowest compensated in the state. And it's because of Prop 13, where demographically, if you look at our numbers, we have a higher percentage of folks that that are of a generation where they were able to buy in when things were more affordable. And then you have a steadily growing pool of folks like myself that bought in when things were ridiculously unaffordable, but we were able to either refinance or lock in an interest rate that will never come again in our lifetime, most likely. What's happening is folks are looking around that are in the same situation that I'm in. And what I have been hearing is a lot of anger, especially here in a town like Moraga. Why am I paying so much for a property where we have dwindling enrollment at schools, which is going to put them at severe financial risk and cause potential draconian cutbacks unless short-term fixes are able to come about? Why do we have commercial centers that are rotting literally with hulks of rusted and non-functional signage, vacant storefronts, illegal RV camps and parking lots? The list goes on and on. Moraga was probably beautiful on a municipal, still beautiful scenically, 50 years ago when everything was still relatively new, but things aren't new anymore. And how are we going to attract new development, new economic stimulus to keep us going, which, by the way, St. Mary's College needs? if they're going to be able to continue to compete on a national front and be able to attract national caliber talent, I hope that the folks that are coming in won't be like me when I came and looked at Moraga and St. Mary's when I was looking at colleges, which was like, for a young kid, there's not a lot of there. And in fact, our kids for decades, unfortunately, have called this Moraga. And we're working to change it, but it's going to happen at Ream first. And thank goodness we have landowners that are willing to work on this with us rather than against us or just be completely apathetic. On the other side of town, we have a completely different story. Because towns no longer have redevelopment, Moraga never established a redevelopment agency. We're one of the few communities in California that never had one. So what happened? Our downtown development happened in Lafayette and Walnut Creek. We're never going to be able to unwind that particular clock. But we can do something more to help make this place somewhere where the kids at St. Mary's actually want to spend money, can afford to spend money, and can afford to live.
On February 18th, we had an episode with Beacon Economics, and they were talking about one of the biggest challenges in the Bay Area is the need to grow, that your economics fundamentally don't continue to work unless we build more housing, allow people in. And part of why our housing value for those who are benefiting from the increase in housing because they bought their house and are sitting on a $2 million house that they bought for 150 grand or 500 grand is because we haven't built, but at the same time, now your kids might not be able to afford it. And so that solution isn't to build on every hillside, build without fire safety in mind. The solution he was arguing was you just have to keep building and making housing for people who want to live here next, because that will balance out those property taxes. That will balance out the need to increase sales taxes.
If your community is a place where the next generation can no longer imagine being able to afford to buy a home, your community's dead. You're just waiting for the corpse to be buried. I'm sorry to use such a dark analogy, but most of us who've been able to fight and scrape to get to a point where we could afford to buy a home in a community like Moraga, I don't think we have much hope that unless our children inherit our homes, that they would voluntarily choose as a starter home, which is what most of the houses in Moraga are, to pay multi-million-dollar values for something that is 60, 70 years old, maybe or maybe not has had any upgrading done to it, just so your kids can go to a good school. Some people might make the judgment either that their local schools aren't really as bad as they think they are, or they might make the judgment that I can really afford the tuition to a private school versus paying that much more for a house. What I look at here is that while the only way out of this is growth, when we've looked in Moraga where to build, we're not talking about pushing the boundaries out into the wildland urban interface further. Our whole community is surrounded by WUI, the wildland urban interface. If you look at a map of the Bay Area and you see where Moraga is, and you just keep going east, it is wildland. In some, like you could actually make a through line for wildland almost all the way down to Mount Hamilton in San Jose from Moraga. And that is by design. And we've looked at potentially additional ingress and egress routes into town. The city of San Ramon, for example, is only 1.6 miles away from Moraga in unpaved road. But because we're now in an era of hyperinflation, especially when it comes to infrastructure projects, that could cost $50 to $100 million just to accomplish that 1.6 miles. Instead, what we're looking at, taking wildfire safety incredibly seriously, is there is a path on Moraga Way. If you go drive down Moraga Way, it's one of our two roads. The main road coming in is Moraga Road. The other one coming in is Moraga Way. Moraga Way is mostly flat. It also has room to have a grade separated emergency lane, either for a third lane of evacuation to get out, or for a lane for first responders to move back and forth to get to a situation where, for example, you can put on out a fire before you get to a full evacuation scenario. Fortunately, we have partners in the city of Orinda. We both jointly applied for a federal grant for $508,000, which was granted to fund this. We got from this Congress and president $508,000 to study how to make Moraga safer. And we're also have a application in, again, jointly with the city of Orinda for $5 million to start construction once that comes through. We're not talking about something that's as difficult as trying to build a new road on an area that has pretty dramatic landslides, like over in Bollinger Canyon. What we're talking about here is a road that's already there, road easements that already exist, where we can add another lane if we need to get out or people need to get in, that we can provide that for safety while we have development, which is infill, where the services are that are close to public transit, which does exist here, grocery stores, the post office, town hall, all of those things. Also, the closest spaces to evacuation, if God forbid we ever need to, versus 30 to 40 minutes out from the highway, which is where some of our residents in Moraga live.
You're talking a lot about the need for growth as an underlying message here to fix long-term economic factors. And that comes up as a big theme everywhere. But the reason we're talking about it, and you mentioned it, is for a long time, people and city leaders have been against growth, and you still have cities in the area that aren't for growth. How does the rest of your council, without naming names, are they all on board? Is the perception to your residents changing for this growth? Do they know it's coming?
The council's on board. They all unanimously just voted for an economic development consultant, Cosmo, one of the highest profile economic development firms in the state, if not the country, to try to bring back some life into Moraga. I would say we have differences of opinion on tone. I am passionate. I pull no punches. I'm direct. And I don't think that folks have really had people on the council as frequently that were willing just to say the way things are and why. And when necessary, point fingers within the bounds of what's appropriate to who's causing those problems. For example, at Ream, I keep talking about Ream Center. We have two primary landowners. There are more than that, but two primary landowners. They are St. Mary's College and U.S. Realty Partners. They're both contemplating doing things other than their current use in a rather dramatic fashion in the near term. On the other side of town, we have Ream Center, which is, from our specific plan purposes, it's more than one landowner, but the majority, the vast majority, is owned by one family and has been since anyone can remember. The other side of town, I'm not sensing the folks think there's much of a rush to do much anything. They sure would love the idea for some of the things that I know that we haven't released publicly yet are going to be happening at Ream. But part of the challenges that a town like ours faces is when you're an investor looking to bring something different, dynamic into a community, one of the first things you're going to do is count the rooftops to try to see if something pencils in. And there's a lot of different grocery store and restaurant labels I've heard people say they want. And at the end of the day, our property values say that we can afford it and we can probably do it. But because we haven't grown, and because historically we've said no to just about everything that came our way, either people have given up on us, or we have landowners that have no incentive. They have zero cost basis because they bought before anything was worth anything. And true, they could sell and make their great grandchildren wealthier than any of us are on this conversation for their lifetime, but they're making enough to get by. So what do we have then when you have owners that are intransigent. Everyone has property rights. We no longer have, as a municipality, the option to open a redevelopment agency. So one of the things I've heard the state is contemplating is a storefront vacancy tax. I would imagine that if the state does that, they will do the same thing they do with all of their fees and taxes. They will keep all of the revenue. I'm sure that people expect, like, for example, you get pulled over for a speeding ticket in a town keeps all the money. No, town keeps maybe 10 to 20% of the money. The rest of it goes mostly to state purposes. I'm sure the same would happen with the vacancy tax, but usually what works in is if you have one before the state fee goes in, you're usually allowed to keep a higher percentage of the revenue from it.
I know there's some arguments from the business community because you're talking about trying to force an owner to do something. In some cases, though, there might not be a tenant that wants to go into that existing space.
Sure.
So those are two different things, because you can tax all the vacant office space, but there's not anybody. It's not that they don't want it to be filled and to make money. Most of the cities do, right? I think Walnut Creek's office vacancy space is 20%. Oakland, that's got a whole other host of issues, but that's 80%. The Tri-Valley is also 20%. It's not that people don't want to fill that 20% in the Tri-Valley or in Walnut Creek. There's nobody there. Now you're talking about a smaller foot traffic. A shout out to some folks in the city of Hercules. They had approached me about getting like a brewery into the town and all of that. It sounds great. Here's the problem. It by itself cannot get enough foot traffic to do the Headlands Brewery that like Moraga and Walnut Creek have now.
To answer that, we have Canyon Club here. I talked to some of the kids at St. Mary's and even some of the employees over at Canyon Club. How many people from St. Mary's come here to enjoy this delicious craft brew? But it's more expensive than the types of bars that college students tend to go to. In and of itself, Canyon Club is not a solution. I wish it was. It's the best place in town.
Also, I'll point out that most college students shouldn't officially be going to a bar or brewery.
I'll just say that when I graduated, I was already 23, so I'm a little on the older side. Given I have a September birthday, of course, I'm not talking
about the grad students, folks.
But even it is the argument on, it must be vacant because there's nothing there to go. Everyone's just buying things on Amazon these days anyway, is actually not true in Moraga. We may not ever get to 100% vacancy, but at least over at Moraga Center, I've heard from multiple small business owners that were willing to open up shop there. Unfortunately, the family that owns the whole center, what I've heard from some of the businesses there at the center, the family just won't respond to you if you call, if they don't know what your business is. Also, a lot of the vacant storefronts are full of random flotsam from the last 50 years or 60 years or 70 years. And those units, even though they look like they might be available for rent, are not. There's no incentive from the people, again, who have zero cost basis, who have free storage, and they're making enough money from the Safeway to actually do very much other than to make their great grandchildren more affluent. What tool do we have, and what level of responsibility, civic responsibility, do the people that own over 200 acres of undeveloped, largely land that's never been developed in human history, to actually do something with that level of responsibility?
There's other cities, Concord. I know I've talked to the mayor there, and they have a couple of shopping centers that are grandpa developed it maybe, and then you now have 16 grandkids who all have a stake in it, and you can't get 16 people to agree, talk to each other, and the vacancies they write off as losses. Let's look at this, and then we got to close. What are some tools? Can you use code enforcement to remove those the parked RVs from space, to clean that up? How do you What are some of the tools to change over that shopping center that you have?
I want to be clear too, when I'm talking about this, I'm not just talking about the area that one particular family owns, because there's multiple areas within the Moraga Center specific plan area that are owned by other owners. And I also think when it comes to code enforcement, it has to be equitable. Whatever you do and whatever you're trying to enforce with one property owner, you have to do it with everyone. And that's just the law. You have to have equal fairness for everyone under the law and how you apply these rules. Part of what we're discussing as part of our economic development initiative with Cosmo are what additional carrots we can provide to folks that really want to come along for the ride, and what types of sticks we have to compel folks that don't want to get on the truck. My job as mayor and my colleagues on the council, their job is not to make somebody money. But if you're already, which we've done, upzoned entire swaths of our town, which on paper will have enriched property owners, especially for ones that have consolidated ownership, by the tune of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know what more incentive you can really offer. And if they're still not open to it, I think it's time to start considering other avenues. For Moraga, it's been 50 years. If people want things to change, we need them to demand it.
That's great. I want to head out with one final short answer question, which I'm asking all the guests this year, is what is your AI tip? How do you use AI in your day that you want to share with everybody out there to learn?
I think Moraga has a loose AI policy. I think it's one of the things on my agenda to try to get us to have more of an active role. I think for my generation, there's come to be, and younger, we've come to expect a certain level of responsiveness from customer service. And let's kid you not, I may have gotten this line from a certain council member in Hercules. Being a member of a council is the lowest paid customer service job in America with the most importance. And people are going to expect more rapid fire responsiveness from their government. How I use AI myself, what I have found is I want to come up with the ideas. I want to write things cogently so they sound like me. But I used to run to my wife because I would never know where to put a comma, or sometimes I would wonder if my sentence structure was off. I can definitely have ChatGPT or even Grammarly correct that for me. If I'm going to put out, for example, like I did today, a blurb and a posting with art about the fact that I have a council meeting tonight. When I worked in PR, I'd have to go to my graphic designer to get that done. Now I can just tell ChatGPT what my intent is, and it comes up with everything. You work with it incrementally along the way. It's really an iterative process. But once you're done, quite as good as what you can get from somebody you pay. But when we're in a volunteer gig, free, or at least close to free, is better than not at all. And our community is demanding a level of responsiveness we cannot meet with the tools from the past century.
Kerry Hillis, the mayor of Moraga.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And Jared, I really am proud of the success you've been able to achieve with this. You are definitely, you're more than a gadfly. You're out there engaged and you genuinely care about the Bay Area. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Capstone Conversation. Don't forget to subscribe and follow Jared Asch and Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Leave us a review and share this episode with a friend.